building using pinch pots, right? Pinch pots are pretty straightforward. What you do is you kind of start out with the same size piece of clay that I would sort of throw to make a cup or a vessel like roughly this size, right? And what I usually do, this will get stuck to here, which I'm fine with, so I'm not super worried about it because I can always cut it off as if it's a wheel. But I start out by putting my thumb as close to that like 1/4 inch from the very bottom as I can, because we don't want a super, super thick base, right? Put my thumb down there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap around with these 2 fingers. I'm kind of just pinching in towards my thumb, like so. And then once I can see I've made a full round of those pinches, I move up just a little bit, and I do bless you. And I just keep doing the same thing. And once I've made a full rotation, I can see where my pinch marks are. I move up a little bit, and I continue the same thing. But all you do, you can kind of think of it, it's almost the same concept as when we're throwing, right? Where like if I'm down here and I'm doing my pinching together here, and I let it get a full rotation before I rise, and then I let it get a full rotation, and then I rise. It's the same concept, except it's almost like the analog version of that, right? Downside to this is like after you make 1 or 2 of these, your wrists are going to feel it and your hands are going to feel it. I don't like to do it that much because I'm trying not to devastate my wrists, right? But if the wheel is a tricky thing for you, like this can be a really useful tool to making kind of taller pieces, right? So that's basically all we do. We go all the way around. And at this point, I am kind of using like my whole 4 fingers here. Get to where we pinched. And then move up. For the first little round of this, I do keep it in my hand like this. That has a tendency to have like the gravity effect of like the weight is kind of keeping it more vertical. Sometimes if I do this on a surface, I end up with a really, really wide thing because things like to be wide, they don't like to be skinny. If I do this, the gravity of it is almost like treating as if I was smacking it from the side, keeping it in right shape, right? So this first round, I do all in my hand to try to get as much height so I don't get a ton of width. And the angle at which you're pinching is also sort of important. If I'm pinching like way out here, I'm going to have more inward pressure than I do outward pressure, so it's going to want to flare out, right? So once I get to the very lip, get it relatively evened out. And I'm not looking for super thin. Because we're going to join these together, I want them to have a little bit of like beef, especially towards the lip, right? Because I want good, solid attachment points. Once we're done, we'll be going through, like once it's a little harder, and removing material, right? And that's how we'll get it to the correct weight. So keep it, I mean, it's easy also to keep it thick and then deal with it later, you know what I mean? Trying to pinch, especially with coils, getting them real thin and then attaching another thing on top is very tricky. So I'd rather just not do that and just deal with it later, you know what I mean? Once I get 1 round through, I'll come in again and do the same thing. I usually will put it flat on a table at this point and pinch around. Because then I can kind of just spin it as my finger kind of just does this. You know what I mean, the whole way? And then we'll work our way up. And this is going to make it a little bit wider because it's not folding in on itself anymore. And we'll just keep pinching up till we get towards the lip. And at this point, it's right where my hand like starts giving out from doing the same thing over and over again, right? So I'm going to take it a little bit slower. And we'll work on the lip here. What we're trying to do is have, kind of like when we're throwing, we want it to be relatively even. I'm going to cut this totally flush just so it's perfectly flat, right? But we don't want to have, kind of like we're throwing, we don't want a huge side and then a really tiny side, right? So from here, I've gotten most of the weight up. I've got it roughly the same size as that one, right? Because I'm going to join them together, that's important. So I'm just going to work a little bit more on the lip here. And then I'll actually take this one, flip it upside down and kind of scope out where my sizes are. They're pretty close. This one's a little bit wider, right? And I want them to match up pretty well. So I'm going to, again, now I'm using more pressure from the inside. You can see I'm kind of like tugging on it here. That'll widen it as I pinch. Absolutely, yeah. So you can do this by throwing 2 pieces on the wheel. You have to be very careful at when you join them together because you use a lot more liquid on the wheel, so things are a lot floppier. So you couldn't just throw 2 pieces and immediately join them. You'd have to like speed dry like with a blowtorch or with a heat gun, the parts that you're going to join together and then flip upside down. And yeah, you can do it. It's pretty advanced. You know what I mean? This is kind of the easy version, but at least we'll start to get the concept going there for if you do want to do that with wheel throwing forms. Yeah, when I was first starting, that's the only way I could make tall stuff, right? If I wanted to make something that was like after firing bigger than even 12 inches, I'd have to throw it in 3 pieces and then join it together. Because you got to remember, clay shrinks a ton and it's really noticeable in a really tall piece. So you'll throw a thing that's like this big, and it'll come out of the kiln, and it'll be this big, and it's like a huge discrepancy. You're like, no, but it was all big. I did good.
It's like that when you go look for your pasta.
Yeah, this one looks like mine, but it's little, and that wasn't my bag. I threw a really tall, really nice piece. So we'll scope it out. It's still a bit wider, so I'm going to spend just a little bit more time widening this out. Trying to get them as even as I can muster. And then I also like, in this point, to do usually some like paddling. That's another way you can kind of thin things out and make them look nice, right? So what I'll do here, if I don't love those pinch marks, you can come in. We have a couple of these paddles, and like any kind of piece of wood with a handle will work. But you can come in and kind of refine the shape a little bit by just having some inside pressure with your fingers, and you're kind of paddling against them. It's almost like the analog version of using a rib when you're throwing, right? And this will help you refine. I want to do this before I join them. That way I can have inside pressure too, right?
Would a wooden spatula, like a kitchen wooden spatula, be heavy enough to do that?
Probably. I think you want a pretty wide surface area, but you can see I'm really only hitting it right here, so it's not a wooden spatula would probably be fine. I've done this just with like rib tools before and stuff.
Those wooden spoons are really
Yeah, wooden spoons. Yeah, they're great. Yeah. But this will just yield me like a slightly more refined looking form. You know what I mean? Like it's a small difference, but it looks nicer. I'm not worried about the very bottom because I'm going to carve that away later on. I'm going to try to just stretch this while it's spinning, because why not? We've got a banding wheel. Now what I'm going to do, if I'm going to want to join these, I'm going to need flat surfaces so that they join together. So I'm going to get this spinning. I'm going to do that same trick we do when we're on the wheel, where I come in from the side, and I let my needle tool kind of skate in like that. And I keep it there. I don't have a ton of pressure because I'm not trying to move the pot, right? I'm just trying to get a nice, even, flat surface. All right, we get to there, we lift off. Now we have a flat to join onto, right? Sometimes I'll come in with just a damp finger and kind of clean up this inside edge because it makes a really sharp bit there. You could also at this point too clean up the very inside of your piece, right? Because I'm making a relatively enclosed form, you're not gonna be able to see inside of it. I'm not super worried about it. But if I was making a cup, I would spend some time sort of smoothing out those pinch marks from the inside as well. And I'm just doing that by like tracing a finger up the side of it, like so. So that seems pretty close, at least for our first one. Now, this thing's pretty stuck on here. But we can use a wire tool, and again, just kind of treat this as if it was the wheel, and we can cut it off. Like so. Because we don't use any water, you can just pick it up right afterwards. Now I'm going to spend a little more time on this one, kind of paddling and making sure that we get it to the right shape, like we did on the other one. All right, so just spend one quick second refining the shape just a little bit. And again, like the shape's not that important because I'm going to be doing reductive carving on it, right? But I want to start from a point that's a little bit easier. That should be relatively good. We'll go ahead and do that same thing where we cut it nice and flat. And if you guys are having trouble doing the part where you're cutting through, right, because it takes so long and you have to sort of just use one hand instead of two, you can use a sharper tool like this here X-Acto blade, and I'll be able to cut through in one fell swoop. You know what I mean? So this can be more helpful. This is kind of tricky because on the wheel you can just let your foot do the power, right? This one you kind of have to use one hand to do that whole thing. So move these off to the side. Clean up this inside edge real quick. Clean up the outside edge. And I'll do a little test fit. Just to sort of see. I imagine these are pretty close. Pretty good, right?
Not bad.
Not bad. So, since we're going to join them, we're going to need a couple tools. What I like to use is either this, I think my favorite tool for this is probably this serrated rib, right? You can buy these. This is one of those tools I think I told you guys first or second class, like this isn't included in the basic pottery tool set, but it costs a couple bucks and it's one of the most useful tools I own. They make these, right? They also make these little like scratchy tools, right? They're basically just like look like a tiny little pitchfork that you use to scratch. I think I like this one better, but either one will do. If you don't have either of these, you can really just like use a needle tool and just do, it just takes forever, right? And so I'm gonna try to avoid that. What I'm gonna do is just while this is spinning, I'm going to give it some kind of cross-hatching. That way I'm making teeth for when I join the two things together, those teeth can kind of interlock and act as glue, right? So we'll go one way, and then we'll spin it around and go the other way. You want it like really scratched like this, right? We'll move that off to the side, put this guy back on, do the same thing. The rasp is good for evening things out. It's not quite as good for leaving scoring marks.
Okay.
So I'm just moving through one way with the teeth, right? And then I'll move through the opposite direction so that we have some cross-hatching going on. And then I'm going to show you guys a little trick. So we need some kind of binding agent, right? Some people would use slip. I don't like the idea of having to like keep all my trimmings and then turn them into goop that's the right consistency and do that whole thing. Most of the time I just use water, but another thing you can use is vinegar.
Is what?
Vinegar. And so I'm just going to add some on here. I'm trying not to keep things super saturated with moisture because I don't want them to get flimsy.
What does the vinegar do?
Vinegar is just like said to like lead to stronger joints, right? As opposed to water. Slip would probably be your best bet, right? Because it's like very goopy and glue-like. But vinegar is supposed to be similar to that. There's a bunch of different like schools of thought, right? There's like some folks use magic water, which is like water mixed with sodium silicate and other chemicals to like make it join better so it dries more evenly. Vinegar kind of is said to do the same thing. So try it out. Like it's really in your practice. Try out all the different steps, see what works best for you, and then you can use that. But I kind of wanted to just show you this so that you know that there's an option there, right? All right, so now we're going to take these, set them on top of each other, try to get them as close to even as we can. I'm just kind of from the top squeezing down just a little bit to try to add some reinforcing pressure of those joints. Kind of give it a... When you have those teeth, sometimes you have to kind of coax them to line up like this. So one of the things I do a lot is like with downward pressure, I jiggle, and that has a tendency to let those teeth interlock. So then from the side, I'm just gonna, from the bottom, kind of scrape around, try to get this relatively even like that, right? You can also do this while it's kind of spinning on here. And again, it's kind of a weird leany shape now. I'm not super worried about that because I'll be able to establish like the exact flat one I want to and move it around once we move on to the like reductive step. And then I'm really going to try to smear from the bottom up. Could be bottom up, could be top down. It actually isn't super important. Those two parts that like where that joint is together, because I want them to be seamless. So I'm just working my way around the piece to do this. I also kind of like the design that leaves. The kind of like a lot of salt fired pieces have this kind of like little bit of like gunk to them. You know what I mean? That I think is interesting. Because it has air inside, the air is going to act as our like inside fingers here, where you'll be able to do some shaping with the paddle too. Again, just to start us out from a slightly closer to finished point. Now what I'm going to do is I got to cut a hole in it because I'm going to be adding coils, right? So I'm going to do there is I need my needle tool. Again, we wanted it kind of close to the middle so that we could cut this hole pretty even, right? We're going to adjust this later so it's not the end of the world. But I want to just do this. And you could use your X-Acto tool for this too if you wanted to. I think I'm just going to take my time and cut in here. I'm going to try to cut in at kind of an angle actually. That way it doesn't fall straight into the piece. And this doesn't have to be super clean because we're going to spend some time refining this afterwards, right? And you can also see from this point, like my base here is real thick. That like has a tendency to happen when you're doing this. So on the bottom side here, I know it's going to be real thick too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to then go back to pinching to try to get that real thick base to be closer to the shape that I want it to be. And also hopefully get some more height out of it, right? So I just want to get this. I want it thinned out because it was like real thick. It was like an inch thick before, right? But I don't want it so thin that when I add coils, it's going to make my life harder. So we'll get it probably to there. Kind of like that 3/4 of an inch is what everything's been so far. You know what I mean? Rough size. And then I'm going to do the same thing we've been doing, where I cut off the top, and then I'm going to add coils onto it. And it's an interesting thing because it almost seems like counterproductive to like get height out of it and then cut that height off. You know what I mean? But we want nice even joins. And so if I just added a coil onto here, it would make my life a little bit more difficult because I'm not starting from a flat, even base. Does that make sense to everybody?
Mhm.
So we're going to go into there. Do the same thing where we kind of round out the inside, round out that outside corner. This is also a good opportunity to clean up the inside seam from those two joins, right? Will you pass me a wooden knife if you don't mind?
Yeah. You mean like one of
Yeah,
those?
perfect. So this is a really good tool for that because it's got this like almost like a finger extension, you know what I mean? That's what this other side is. So from the inside, before I make this more narrow, I'm gonna come in here and just smooth out those join marks from where I attach those two pieces. Working up and then working down. This will also widen it a little bit because I'm kind of doing some shaping from the inside, you know what I mean? Which isn't the end of the world. Because we're gonna refine the shape afterwards too. But I really want those two seams to kind of disappear. Again, it's the inside of a piece, so it's not that important. You're not going to see it necessarily, but this will ensure that it's a stronger bond at least. And as I'm doing this, you can see the outside seam kind of reappearing a little bit, so I'll have to spend a little bit more time cleaning up the outside now. That seems fine. We'll do one more round of this guy. Trying to make sure there's not a visible line there. Like so. Cool. So from here, we're going to be adding coils onto it to build even more height, right? Theoretically, you could do this without adding the other pinch pot on top. That's just like an easy way to gain a lot of height really quickly. I could keep adding pinch pots if I wanted to, like say I wanted to do one of those gourd shapes, right? But what I have here in the back is a bunch of coils that we made. And so these happen by just taking any sort of little, you can use even just like this excess pieces of clay you have, like all this stuff, squish it together, and then I'll move to this side for this. I kind of just squish it into like a rough coil shape like this, and then I roll it, usually on a canvas table, just to get it to the right thickness that I need. If anyone has not done this before, this is the concept, right? They don't have to be super even for our purposes. Like these ones are pretty even and nice and round, but like they could not be and it wouldn't be the end of the world. So to add a coil onto this, we're going to do kind of the same thing that we did before. We're going to do the scratch and attach, right? We're going to make a cross hatch on the top here. And then I'm going to make a cross hatch on this surface, because I want them to join together well. Then I'm going to take my paintbrush, dip it in some vinegar, kind of work my way around. I don't want, especially at this point, I don't want it to be super goopy or super wet, because we're going to continue to add coils on top, and the weaker it gets, the harder it's going to be, right? What I'm then going to do is come down from the top and have a little bit of downward pressure as I'm spinning it. You can see I'm kind of, on this side it's easier to see, I'm kind of pinching it into a triangle shape just to really add some pressure onto there.
Did you score first?
Yeah, I scored both sides, yep. Yeah, whenever you're attaching things, it makes sense just to score both sides of it. And you can see I'm kind of working on the inside edge of my flat that I made. If I worked on the outside edge, it would have a tendency to flare out, and I want it to flare in. So I'm going to get it to right where they're going to attach. I'm going to flatten this just a smidge, and then I'm going to score this part too. And then maybe give it like a little dab of vinegar. And then I'm going to squeeze them down so they overlap, and then I'm going to pinch off above it, right? So then I'm going to just refine what I did there and really make sure I spend some time joining those two pieces together, like so. And I'm kind of just bracing it from the outside so that it doesn't get all like floopity-floppity on me and like want to run away. It's fine that it has this little tail thing here because I'm going to cut that off later. So again, just kind of pinching. Now I'm kind of pinching underneath where that attachment point is, just to kind of get them to a relatively even thickness. And then we'll do sort of that same thing where I come in from the side. And whatever side's thicker is the side that I usually smear, right?
Can you do like a continuous coil?
And keep going up and keep going up. You potentially could. I like the idea of having rings of coils just because I know I'm always starting from a flat, you know what I mean? It works better for me. But yeah, you potentially could just keep going around and around and around and around. You'd end up with like a side that's a little taller than the other, which is not the end of the world because you're going to cut it off anyways. But I just like to work in rings because it gives me a good opportunity to clean up each one before I move on to the next one. And then traditionally, like I would let this sit for a while before I added the next one. That way it's a little bit firmer, right? After your third or fourth one, you've added 3 layers of moisture to it, right? So it's gonna get a little looser on you. So that's usually why I like to do one at a time. Get it going to like there. I'll clean up the inside a little bit. You can do that with a rib. You can do that with the wooden knife because it kind of acts as like a finger elongator, right? And then I'm not super worried about this being perfectly even because it's not the final coil. I do not like how much this one sticks up though, right? So what I'm gonna do is with my X-Acto blade, just kind of come in here from the side and just cut that off. From there, I do want this a little flatter because I'm gonna be joining other stuff onto it. So I'm just gonna spend a second kind of flattening it out so that it's a wider surface area for my next coil. Right? Now it's kind of the rinse and repeat, right? It's like when we're throwing, we just like keep doing pulls until we get our desired effect. Do some cross hatching here. Grab a new coil. Grab my back stock. And then also make sure your coils are long enough to make one full swoop, right? Especially on a wider piece, the length of coil you need is like kind of surprising. If anyone wants to know the formula for figuring that out, let me know and I can go over it with you. But I was just kind of do like a rough estimate real quick to go like, yeah, this is definitely long enough, so we're good. Set this down real quick. We'll do the same kind of scratch and attach thing on here. That same thing, I'm kind of leaning in when I place the coil because I want it to narrow out more towards the top. Nice downward pressure and outward pressure. Where they're going to overlap. I'll make sure the bottom one is really stuck on. I usually, again, kind of flatten this a little bit. Score it real quick. Add just a pinch of our glue. And then I'll overlap them. And then I'll pinch off the excess. So again, same thing. I just want to make sure that those joints are really good. So I'm just kind of pinching them together. Making sure we're working off of a good joint, a good seam. And then I'm going to come through and refine that by scraping them together, right? Usually with a little bit of pressure from our rinsing hand. And this will just yield you like a little bit of extra height, you know what I mean, if the 2 pinch pots didn't quite get you there. You could theoretically start from a coil, like just have a slab, you know what I mean, and then start coil building from there. The pinch pots just kind of save you a little bit of time, and I also wanted you guys to know how to make them. Again, I just want to make things nice and evened out, coming from the inside. Kind of seal those 2 things together. And then we will cut this one completely flush because I want it to be nice and even because this is going to be my last layer. Make sure I get all the way through before I lift up. There we go. And from here, I'm going to actually pinch this, trying to pull it towards the inside a little bit more. And I'm going to pinch it pretty thin so I don't have to deal with it later. From here, we could be doing some paddling if we want to. What I would usually do now is I'll let this get to leather hard. And then almost like we trim the bottoms of pots if they get a little bit too dry, we trim them with the Sureform. Same concept applies here. I'm going to do some of it now just so you can see. But we can just do some reductive movements here to get rid of that weight and really refine the shape that we want. You know what I mean? So I would just spend probably too long making sure that everything's like nice and neat and pretty, and then we have our finished piece. Oh.